Fear is an intriguing thing. Its goal is to protect you, to keep you from dying. However, interestingly and messily, it often goes hand in hand with desire. Where one seeks stability, the other craves change, movement despite the risk. At a society's level, fear and desire often take the shape of monsters that we use as metaphors for anxieties that we can't so easily name otherwise. Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Lucia and I like talking about history and art and pop culture, and today, vampires. It's spooky season and I will be celebrating it with a series of videos on different monsters from popular culture and what they can teach us about ourselves. So, what do vampires say about our fears and desires as a society? Why does it feel like they're not as scary as they used to be? Why do we find them so attractive? And very importantly, why are they usually loaded? Let's find out. Vampires are often explicitly members of the aristocracy. They are frequently wealthy, and even when they're not, they still tend to exhibit traits associated with high-class individuals. They are sophisticated and refined. They appreciate beauty and luxury, comforts that go hand in hand with violent and often sexual or sexually coded behaviors. If you wanted to define them in a word, you could say they are decadent. To illustrate my point, who is blonde, beautiful, arrogant, bisexual, and has a sexy voice? Well, you might be thinking of the pale thirst trap Astarion from Baldur's Gate 3.
But it was I, Dio!
I really wanted to include a JoJo reference in my first video. Dio Brando, the antagonist from the manga and anime JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, isn't canonically aristocratic. However, he is still a character defined by his panache, much like Astarion. Both of them are posh, they're smart, and they're sexually ambiguous, somewhat effeminate. And that is also a trend among vampires. In fact, check out what comes at first when I search some famous vampires online. Homosexuality is a recurring theme in vampire fiction, either explicitly or implicitly. The vampire poses a perceived threat to a certain idea of masculinity. Have you seen those videos of men being absolutely baffled by the possibility of a heterosexual woman preferring a more feminine-looking guy over a buff Chad, to the point where they accuse the women of lying about their taste? The vampire archetype tends to cater to that taste. The thing about vampires, you see, is that they're everywhere. They have been at the forefront of popular culture for a long time, relentlessly. How long, do you ask? Some argue that there have been vampire stories of sorts for millennia and across cultures. However, while blood-sucking or revenant-like beings appear in ancient mythologies, the vampire, by that name and as we know it, is, all things considered, a fairly recent invention. Coming from the Eastern European folk tradition, the word vampire entered most European languages in the early 18th century, coinciding with the first well-documented cases of alleged vampirism. The thing is that nowadays, whenever unusual burial practices that predate this time are discovered, some scholars and journalists refer to them as anti-vampire burials. You've probably seen them: face-down burials, stones covering the body, decapitations, all sorts of funky, unpleasant stuff. But really, these practices are believed to aim to prevent the dead from rising, not necessarily as vampires, but as malevolent undead or spirits, of which there are countless types. Markman Ellis, in his book The History of Gothic Fiction, writes, "The vampire has a perverse modernity, a terror of recent invention manifested as a monster from time out of mind, from deep history." I find this idea compelling because, as we're going to see, the vampire speaks of anxieties that are very intrinsic to European modernity. They belong to the society that emerged after the Middle Ages, with the end of feudalism, the end of absolutist monarchies, the social and technological revolutions of the 1700s and 1800s, and the advent of European democracy and capitalism. It feels like it's only after knowing the vampire that we intentionally seek its origins in other, more remote monsters. So, I want to put the monster into context. Let me take you on a trip to see how we went from this to this and to this, shall we? A few decades before the vampire became the epitome of yearning for things that are bad for you, a wave of vampire hysteria of a different kind shook Europe. In the 1730s, the European population was seized by a frenzied fear and widespread debate about the existence of vampires, in what came to be known as the vampire controversy of the 18th century. One of the first recorded alleged vampiric attacks concerns a man called Arnold Paul, who in 1732 was said to come out of his grave to suck the blood of several people, killing 4 of them in a village in Hungary. The story made the news across Europe and sparked a heated debate about superstition. Some saw it as the perfect example of the kind of ignorance that the rational ideas of enlightenment came to shed light on. And some even used the occasion to shit on women, because why not? This was the case of an anonymous writer of the British journal The Craftsman, who wrote an essay where a fictional narrator with a suitably pedantic name, Caleb Danvers, a doctor in physics, is determined to teach a good lesson to an impressionable, suitably nameless, and beautiful young lady portrayed as a great admirer of strange and wonderful occurrences. So, of the supernatural. Ellis points out in the previously mentioned book that the essay's gendering of credulity as feminine and reason as masculine is not accidental. Well, is it ever? Women are so naive and gullible. Yes, particularly when you write them to be my man, they don't have a lot to say in the matter then. This is my cue to say that I will be posting a video on vampires and female autonomy soon, to bite a bit deeper into the male archetypes at play in the vampire myth. Let me know if that is something that interests you. Misogyny aside, the Craftsman essay is interesting for a different reason. The writer goes on to make some tongue-in-cheek associations between vampires and politicians. He writes, "You see that the method by which these vampires are said to torment and kill the living is by sucking out all their blood, and what is a more common phrase for a ravenous minister than a leech or a bloodsucker who fattens himself upon the vitals of his country?" Pretty much immediately after coming into the public eye, the vampire started being relentlessly used in this way, as a metaphor for a variety of social illnesses. Wherever some perceived parasitic activity was taking place, someone would invoke the vampire. Still in the history of Gothic fiction, Ellis writes, "The term bloodsucker appeals to the sanguinary principle that wealth and money are a kind of vitality that circulates in the economy, like blood in the body. The force that makes men prey on the vital force of others is commercial competition. Bloodsucking is a metaphor for seeking personal advantage and, by extension, for selfish greed and upward social mobility." Now, something big happened at the end of the 18th century. Perhaps you can guess what.
Well, sacre bleu me, if that isn't France, which it is, if it's not the 1780s, which it is, and if that right there isn't a very angry Frenchman, which it is.
During the French Revolution, the commercial aristocracy was often referred to as blood-sucking vampires amongst the revolutionaries. The aristocratic privileges that they enjoyed had been accepted as God-given in medieval times, while the contract between the aristocrats and peasantry was in place. What is that contract, you ask? In very broad terms, in medieval Europe, society was structured in 3 estates or social groups with different rights, duties, and social status. The first estate was the oratores, those who pray, also known as the clergy. The second was the nobility, or the bellatores, those who fight. And the third was the laboratores, those who work, which included everyone else, peasants, artisans, and other commoners. Originally, it was a very agrarian society where the majority of the population were peasants working the land. So the contract was this. The nobles, or aristocrats, owned the land and offered military protection to the peasants, and the peasants labored the land and paid tribute in exchange for said protection.
Now you listen to me, you grubby little commoner. You'll work my fields for pittance and you'll be thankful. Otherwise, I'll throw you off my land and give your job to... What's that one called?
That's Phil.
Phil.
There was very limited social mobility between the estates, and they were hereditary, which meant that if you were born a peasant, you and your children would almost certainly die peasants. However, a new merchant social class emerged among the artisans as the cities grew in size century after century, and it gradually evolved into an economically powerful force in its own right. By the 18th century, it had accumulated enough power to challenge this status quo and reclaim some of those aristocratic privileges for itself. This class was to be known as the bourgeoisie, literally from the Frankish word burg or city. Stay with me because this is still all relevant to our vampiric topic. I swear. The French Revolution is often portrayed as a revolution of the people, a revolution of the oppressed majority against a very privileged minority. And in many ways it was. However, the lower classes of society didn't actually lead the revolution. They were definitely mobilized by it, but the driving force behind it, politically, economically, and intellectually, was the bourgeoisie. They were the real adversary to the aristocracy, and they were the ones who got to eat that cake. Lawyers, bankers, business owners, all the liberal professions, they were the golden boys of the time, and they wanted more recognition and political agency. I don't know what to tell you. The bourgeoisie was the victor in this paradigm change, and though the aristocracy wasn't completely defeated, let's be serious, they never actually left. Things never went back to how they had been before. The bourgeoisie got to write the rules of the new game, but their relationship with the aristocracy remained complex. On the one hand, it was a relationship of hatred and rivalry, but on the other, it was also one of desire and taboo. The narrative surrounding the aristocracy was one of degeneracy, excessive parties, incest, extravagance, utterly godless behavior. But aristocrats were also cultured, educated, refined. Sounds familiar? It's time to enter the realm of Gothic fiction and see how, by the influence of the most infamous rake, the vampire became the avatar of the fallen aristocracy. Many of the monsters in Gothic literature, including the vampire, exist between life and death. In this society that is not feudal anymore, but it hasn't entirely embraced industrial capitalism yet. Enter Lord Byron, poet, rake, and aristocrat, and his friend and physician William Polidori. Lord Byron was a romantic British writer whose libertine personal life was deeply intertwined with his craft, to the point where his persona is often seen as arguably more influential than his writing. In the summer of 1816, he was bitterly fleeing England to escape excessive public attention about his failed marriage, the rumors about his bisexuality, and his intimate relations with his half-sister. Yeah. As he travelled across Europe with Polidori, the pair spent some time in the Alps with Percy Shelley and Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley. As a form of entertainment, they started a ghost story competition that would turn out to be one of the most famous literary events in history. In 2 weeks, Mary wrote Frankenstein and arguably invented the sci-fi genre, which is really impressive. And Polidori took up a discarded idea by Byron involving a vampire and developed it into a novella that would be published 3 years later under the name The Vampire. And this is also huge because though, unlike Frankenstein, the novella's literary quality has often been referred to as comme ci comme ça, this is the first time that we see the vampire represented as a sophisticated, alluring, and enticing figure. See, Polidori wasn't just explicitly inspired by Byron's idea, he modeled his vampire in his image. As I said, Byron was a celebrity at the time, and he was a scandalous figure. He was highborn, sexually deviant, incestuous, decadent, and the prudish, God-fearing British society couldn't have enough of it. So when the monster was imbued with that same allure, they couldn't have enough of it either. The vampire represents what the bourgeois fears about the aristocracy, but also what they desire. It's simultaneously a fear and a desire for regression. The vampire threatens the bourgeois achievements, their autonomy, their power, and their belief system, but they do so by means of seduction. The aristocracy and the vampires are perceived to be beautiful, cultured, and refined, which are things that the bourgeoisie wants for itself. As Gerald E. Hoggle writes in the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Literature, Gothic fictions have most often been about upper middle class white people caught between the attractions or terrors of a past once controlled by overweening aristocrats or priests, and forces of change that would reject such past, yet still remain held by aspects of it, including desires for aristocratic or superhuman powers. Furthermore, there is a fantasy of submission at play. In the same way that the vampire victim is seduced by the vampire and to an extent wants to be hunted, so does the bourgeoisie want to be ruled. Because change is difficult and violent. Europeans were in a period of in-betweenness. Power was being redistributed, new institutions were being created, and new technology was changing the way in which people worked and traveled and measured time. The world beyond Europe was being colonized, controlled and exploited by force, and there were internal power struggles, fears that the lower classes would rebel against the terrible conditions that they continued to live in. Factory work turned out to be just as bad, if not worse, than vassalage. Understandably, the new bourgeois rulers feared that they would do to them what they had done to the aristocracy, because why wouldn't they? So, of course, submitting to your former master, letting someone else decide for you, can be attractive because it's easier and because it's known to you. But the vampire is a cautionary tale for the bourgeoisie. You're not to trust your senses, you're not to trust your desire, because as mesmerizing and beautiful and exciting as this creature is, submitting to their seduction means death and damnation. The monster does not care for you. They will use you and exploit you. If you submit, you will be forsaken by God, condemned to roam without ever seeing the light of day, not dead and not alive. You would become an unnatural being. Bourgeois morality represented the salvation against the aberrant behaviors of the aristocracy, exemplified by the vampire. Having this context, it's not that surprising that vampires are queer-coded. Vampirism was seen as an offense to nature, as homosexuality and, to an extent, sex without reproductive ends were seen as an offense to nature in the bourgeois Protestant mind. And the aristocracy, with its idleness and depravity, perfectly embodied those unholy tendencies. Plus, they were leeches. 2 centuries later, the cautionary tale that surrounded vampirism seems to have lost a lot of its strength. While they remain a sex symbol, the danger they represent is usually downplayed in modern accounts. This can be partially attributed to Christian religious beliefs not being so prevalent. If you remove the threat of eternal damnation, your monster loses a lot of its oomph. But also the fact that Western society's attitudes towards homosexuality and other practices formerly perceived as deviant have become much more positive means that only the desire remains, with little of the fear. However, I believe there is another dimension to how vampires have become toothless, if you will, in recent times. In the 20th century, the vampire stepped away from horror and into drama, comedy, and teen media. From the 1970s, particularly after the success of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire novels, vampires started being portrayed not as monsters, but as sympathetic figures, sometimes with tragic backstories. They stopped being the villain, or solely the villain, to become companions, lovers, and even heroes. This is particularly obvious from the 1990s, when we see a steep increase in vampire stories across all genres and media that gave way to a vampire craze in the 2000s and 2010s. Just in film and TV we have modern takes on classic stories like Bram Stoker's Dracula or the more recent Nosferatu. Action films like Blade, the Underworld franchise, Van Helsing, teen and young adult series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Vampire Diaries and Twilight, horny TV shows like True Blood, comedies like What We Do in the Shadows, and even artsy independent films like Only Lovers Left Alive or A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. These are just a few of the many vampire stories that have come out in the last 35 years. So, in these last 3 decades, we've seen more stories about vampires than ever, and simultaneously, the vampires in those stories are less scary than ever. Why? On the one hand, the 80s did a great job at cementing vampires as cool, youthful, bisexual icons, but I wonder if our attitudes towards wealth have influenced this change as well. Because another big thing happened in 1991. Can you guess what? After the fall of the Soviet Union, we entered global post-industrial capitalism, or capitalist realism, as defined by the dearly missed Mark Fisher in his 2009 eponymous book. An era where, in most of the world, there is scarce opposition to neoliberal policies, where public services and institutions that were at the center of social agendas in the 20th century are in the process of being dismantled or heavily eroded, with the marketization of healthcare, education, housing, transport, energy, etc. and where the pervasiveness of capitalist ideology is so insidious and total that conceiving of an alternative economic system seems an impossible task. In his outstanding and incredibly accessible book, Capitalist Realism, Fisher writes, "Capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours, and the zombies it makes are us." I plan on making a video on zombies, so we will have a look at the other side of that coin. But here we see again that connection between blood-sucking and economic exploitation, the dehumanizing nature of capitalism as a vampiric system. I can't help but notice that, together with all of these vampire media, in recent times there's also been a huge surge in content about the extremely wealthy, particularly since the 2008 crash. To name a few examples, The Wolf of Wall Street, Real Housewives, The Square, Succession, The White Lotus, Parasite, Triangle of Sadness, The Menu, Saltburn. These are just the ones that came to mind, by the way. While most of these stories have a mild, often satirical critique of class inequality, the main characters are usually rich people. It's their stories we watch, it's them whom we sympathize with and who we care about. Plus, they're beautiful and glamorous and their clothes are pretty and they inhabit stunning places, and that is all very attractive. And don't get me wrong, I love some of these stories. What I'm saying doesn't necessarily speak of their quality or their relevance, but I think they are a symptom. It seems like as our own living conditions deteriorate, we're increasingly obsessed with the rich and powerful, but the content we consume is more aspirational than it is critical. It's the vampire story without the cautionary tale. It's the aristocrat, but not a lot is monstrous about it. So, if greed is not perceived as a personal flaw, but a quality akin to ambition, if accumulating immense wealth through the work of others is not perceived as parasitic, but praiseworthy, if no God is waiting to judge you for exploiting others, is it that surprising that vampires are not scary anymore, just sexy? Gosh, how did we get here? Rhetorical question, since I wrote, recorded and edited this video, but all is to say, what a ride. To sum things up, we've seen that vampires haven't been around for as long as some people think. They came into public light in the 1700s. We've learned that they quickly became an avatar for the fallen aristocracy, as they represent the fears and desires that the bourgeoisie had for its old masters, that they have continuously been very prominent in pop culture in the last 200 years, but went supernova in the 90s and 2000s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, invading all genres and media, and that they have changed substantially in the process, losing their teeth to appear increasingly harmless as our attitudes towards wealth accumulation at any cost have become more and more indifferent or even benign. You can expect that other video on vampiric boyfriends and female autonomy soon, so if you don't want to miss that, do subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. This is a new channel, so all support is greatly appreciated, and it will give me motivation to make more videos. Thank you so much for making it till the end. All right, bye.